Hello, and welcome to the 81st bi-monthly CDC-USBC webinar. My name is Danae Schmidt. I am the Member Relations and Operations Manager here at USBC, and I am so glad to welcome you to today's session. This series is jointly hosted by CDC's Division of Nutrition, Physical Activity, and Obesity, and by the USBC. So these webinars are referred to as the 222, and they are held on the second Tuesdays of even-numbered months from 2 to 3 p.m. Eastern Time. The purpose of this series is to bring together practitioners and advocates from the field of maternal and child health to share best practices, resources, and to network and collaborate on issues of national significance. We alternate the sessions, highlighting the work of breastfeeding coalitions one month and a national or international organization the next. Coalition members and breastfeeding advocates from around the country can join us for these free webinars. The topic and speaker details are posted on the Coalition's Learning Connection as well as on the USBC's public website. You can find it at usbreastfeeding.org/coalitions-webinars. To get all of our announcements, we encourage you to join the Coalition's Learning Connection, which is a free online community for all Coalition members. We do want to remind you that a user account for the USBC website is required to access this community, and it only takes a few seconds to set it up. Once you're logged into your account, simply go to usbreastfeeding.org/coalitions-connect and click the join button on the right-hand side. So to streamline access, these webinars have been set up as a series. Once you register for a session, you're all set. You will receive reminders before each webinar with the topic and speaker details. We understand that it's not possible to attend every session live in the midst of your busy workday, so there's easy access to all archived recordings. The webinar presentation, any handouts, and video recordings of all sessions can be found on the Coalition's webinar page. The link to the webinar page can be found in your webinar confirmation email, and it's also been provided in the chat box. So to download materials from our website, you simply go to usbreastfeeding.org, hover your mouse over the Learning Collaborative tab, and then click on CDC-USBC bi-monthly webinar series. For today's session, all participants are in listen-only mode during the presentation. We hope this session will be as interactive as possible, so please share your insights and questions as they come to you throughout the presentation by using the question or chat box. And here's how you do that. Go to your control panel on the right of your screen. If you don't see it, it may be minimized. Click on the orange tab and it'll pop back out. If you scroll down below the audio section, you'll see a tab for questions. When you click on it, it will open up a box for you to type in. If you'd like to ask a question verbally during the Q&A session, please go ahead and raise your hand using the raise hand icon, which is located under the microphone icon, as you can see here. We'll call on you and unmute your mic. For the best audio connection, we do recommend dialing in rather than using your mic and speakers, which is dependent on your Wi-Fi connection. To switch your audio from computer to phone, go to your audio tab, select phone, and dial in using the information provided. If you continue to have issues or have any other webinar-related tech problems, please send an email to coalitions@usbreastfeeding.org, and our staff will do their best to help you. And that brings me to today's session, taking your breastfeeding coalition to the next level. Are you looking for ways to move your state breastfeeding coalition from all volunteers to paid staff? From donations to contracts and grants? During this interactive webinar, you will have the opportunity to hear from the executive directors of the New Mexico Breastfeeding Task Force and the Kansas Breastfeeding Coalition to learn how they have successfully moved their coalition to the next level. Following a brief presentation from the New Mexico Breastfeeding Task Force and Kansas Breastfeeding Coalition, the panel will be open for questions and discussion with the audience about the practicalities of building a strong state breastfeeding coalition. Ask questions about contracts for special projects using independent contractors, and much more. We encourage you to ask as many questions as possible so that we can learn from each other. I am delighted to introduce our presenters for today's session. Brenda Bandy is the Executive Director and founding member of the Kansas Breastfeeding Coalition. Brenda oversees the KBC's programs working with employers, child care providers, families, public health, hospitals, and community organizations. She has a passion for addressing barriers to breastfeeding through policy, systems, and environmental changes, and is constantly looking for innovative ways to make breastfeeding easier for families. Brenda has also been an active member representative to the USBC since 2011. Jennifer Mastropolito, prior to becoming Executive Director of the New Mexico Breastfeeding Task Force in June 2018, served United Way of Central New Mexico for 14 years as Vice President of Community Impact and Chief Development Officer. She led workplace campaigns and major gift solicitation, built and managed community impact programming and projects, trained nonprofit boards and program staff, and managed communications and strategic planning. A U.S. Navy veteran, Jennifer also has 30-plus years experience in public relations, marketing, teaching, social service, program, and fund development. Monica Esparza currently serves as Deputy Director of the New Mexico Breastfeeding Task Force, providing programmatic support, chapter development, member and volunteer engagement, and direction for outreach and communications. Previously, as a New Mexico Breastfeeding Task Force workplace liaison, Monica helped expand the program from 2 counties to statewide, ensuring businesses comply with laws about breastfeeding in public places. In addition, Monica served as a WIC breastfeeding peer counselor for many years, providing one-on-one peer support to pregnant and breastfeeding families in her community. She also piloted the Breastfeeding Hospital program and mentored new breastfeeding peer counselors. Thank you all for joining us today, and with that, I'm going to turn it over to Brenda.
Thank you so much. This is Brenda Bandy with the Kansas Breastfeeding Coalition, and I'm going to share my screen here so we can get started. Thank you to everyone for taking time to join us today. Whoops, let me go back. There we go. I just want to give a context before Jennifer and Monica join in on the discussion for what was the foundation for today's webinar. This came about because of a question that was posted on the coalition's discussion list from a coalition asking to speak with, quote, more mature coalitions about lessons learned specifically around contracts and doing more of a fee-for-service type of experience. And that discussion actually took off. And when Jennifer and I responded, yes, we would be happy to talk with you, the original coalition, many more coalitions chimed in and said, can we join that call? And USBC, being what it is, naturally was a good fit for extending that conversation to a webinar. We quickly realized that rather than just holding a call for a few coalitions, that this topic might be of interest to a larger group. So that was the impetus for today's webinar, was really coalitions talking to each other to share lessons learned, because we're all on this journey together. And I know over the years, I have spoken with several coalitions who have asked me specifically, what have we done in Kansas? And so this is an extension of that as well. So this webinar is different maybe from past webinars that you might have participated in, because our conversation, our formal presentation is going to be rather brief, and we really want the most of the webinar to be time for discussion and for people on the call to ask the questions that are kind of burning issues for your coalition. So next, Jennifer.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for taking time out of your schedules to join us today. When we began the conversation about what we might present, we had many discussions about the wide range of things we could possibly talk about, and you see a little graphic of that here. Obviously, talking about all of these things would take more than an hour, and so we had to pare it down to the most operational keyword for today, things that we could share. Obviously, more conversations might be necessary to take your particular group to the next level, but we're going to focus on these 3 areas: staff, funding, and partnerships for today's presentation. I would like to add that this is an operational focus. So while the conversations could include larger strategic ideologies, today we are just going to focus on operationally, how do you make these things happen to take your coalition to the next level. Brenda, back to you.
Okay. Sorry, as I'm getting ready to advance the slide. Here we go. Okay, so we're going to start by talking about one of the most common questions that we've received both on the discussion list as well as over the years from coalitions. And that is, how do we make the move from an all-volunteer organization to actually paying someone or more than someone to do parts of the work? And we wanted to start with talking about independent contractors, because for most coalitions, this is going to be the entry point for paying someone to do a specific task. So contractors are different from employees. Oftentimes people think, we want paid employees. Having an employee is usually further down the road. I know for the Kansas Breastfeeding Coalition, we started with myself as a contractor doing a specific task around our employment, our business case for breastfeeding. And then as we got more contracts and grants, then my contract expanded. And we also then worked with other individuals to do specific tasks as contractors. And it wasn't until just a few years ago, when all of my time was for the Kansas Breastfeeding Coalition, that I became the first paid employee. But we still use many independent contractors to do smaller projects. And the beauty of the independent contractor arrangement is that it takes a specific contract or grant that you may have and translates those deliverables to a specific task for those employees. And not employees, I'm sorry, as contractors. You do have they have their own obligations to pay their own taxes. So you'll see that we did make a note there that you should get a W-9 from the individuals that you're contracting with, and they will receive a 1099 form from your organization in January of every year, so that they are responsible for paying their own taxes. So that takes all of the burden from the coalition to do payment withholding, employee withholding. You don't have to worry about that with independent contractors. So it really is a very simplified arrangement between your coalition and an individual to do the work. And I believe, Monica, you are going to describe to us the deliverables and the connection, the scope of work. Oh, and Monica, we can't hear you if you're on mute.
Sorry about that. Thank you so much, Brenda.
Sure.
I think one of the main things to keep in mind is that contractors are just that, they're contractors. They have very specific goals and deliverables that they complete according to what their scope of practice is. So one of the things to keep in mind is, for example, for New Mexico Breastfeeding Task Force, we are all contractors. And that means that we all have our deliverables, we all have our projects that we have in mind. And that means also that you can contract specific people to do the work that you need them to do. For the New Mexico Breastfeeding Task Force, we have several programs that we have going on, and each program has their own contractors that work on that specific program. In addition to that, one of the things that can help you as far as moving your coalition along is that to think about certain things that the coalition has that needs a lot of support from a lot of people. For example, for the New Mexico Breastfeeding Task Force, our annual conference and our membership and board meetings tend to require a lot more support and a lot more help. So what we have done is we have weaved in the that the contractors will be providing support for the conference and for the member meetings. And that helps us to pull in our resources and manage the conference and the board meetings and member meetings with our contractors, and not have to hire any additional staff. The other piece to keep in mind is that you really need to clarify the scope of practice, clarify the details of what their end goal is and who they report to. For New Mexico Breastfeeding Task Force, each program reports to a specific person. Our clinical program reports to Jennifer, and the outreach program reports to me. So the contractors don't necessarily have to report to all of the contractors have to report to a specific person, but you do need to identify who that person is. And another piece to keep in mind is that there is a special place for contractors as far as making sure that they deliver what the work is that they need to do. So it's easier to manage them because they're not employees. You don't have to navigate their day-by-day work. Instead, what you do is you allow them to just complete the project and do the project on their own, very much just with minimal oversight. And then I'll give it back to Brenda to finish up this slide.
Okay. Thank you, Monica. I think we also want to mention that it's in the best interest of the coalition that independent contractors not serve on the board. While it is possible for that to happen, there is a perception of conflict of interest. So simply to avoid that perception, it would be best that anyone you contract not also be serving on the board, because the board usually is the entity that they respond to. The other thing is, you might be thinking, holy cow, a contract, where do I get started? What we want to let you know is that there is a template that exists, and actually the USBC had a template that they shared with the Kansas Breastfeeding Coalition a long time ago. I know they still have it. We do as well. And it has about 5 pages of a lot of legal information in there, but it actually is protective of the coalition, because in that 5 pages of legal stuff, it does define, for example, the ownership of any products that may come out of this work, that those are work for hire and that they belong to the coalition and not to the individual who had done the work. It also spells out things like use of logos, that the contractor can't use the coalition's logo for other projects. It also spells out expense reimbursement. Maybe you have a contractor who's doing trainings and you don't want to worry about having to calculate mileage and reimburse. So you can say that all of your expenses for travel is included in your payment from us. Or you could say that you can submit your mileage for reimbursement. So in that contract is where you can spell out what things, in addition to the payment, the contract amount, you would be willing to reimburse, what additional expenses, say copies, for example, and that kind of thing. So it's really important to have this in writing for those things that I just mentioned, and it's not at all intimidating. So if you are interested in exploring this, please feel free to reach out to me. I'm happy to share with you the template that we've been using successfully for the last probably 5 years or so, or more. Okay, and I think we will transfer to the next slide, and that's you, Jennifer.
Great. So now let's talk about funding. How do you get funding for your independent contractors? I know you're about ready to move. There you go. So I'd like to start by just talking about the need for a variety of sources of funding ultimately. You might not start out that way. You might start out because you have funding from a single source, a single large grant, for example, or a subcontract. But ultimately, to grow your organization, you really need to have a mix of fundraising sources or financial sources. I call it the 4 or multi-leg stool of financial resources. That typically includes grants, donations, whether that is memberships or sponsorships or corporate or individual donations, contracts or subcontracts, and some sort of fee for service or for products. That is generally true of nonprofits, no matter what they're doing, those four or multi-leg stool of financial resources. Just think about it. The more legs you have on your stool, the sturdier it is. The thing that we wanted to point out about grants in particular is, first of all, the USBC in their Power Tools archives has wonderful support for both seeking grants and for writing grants. And if you've never written a grant, I would definitely encourage you to take some sort of training before you do that. It really helps a lot to focus your requests. Also, it's important to think about different kinds of grants, the range of work that you might be doing. We talk about at the New Mexico Breastfeeding Task Force of taking off the breastfeeding blinders and thinking about the wide range of mother, child, and family and community engagements that we do that might lend itself to other kinds of grants that aren't specific to breastfeeding. For example, we have a training for which we believe we might be able to get an economic development grant, and we'll be looking for that. Also, another way that you might increase your financial resources is through subcontracting or subawards. New Mexico Breastfeeding Task Force had a partnership with one of the hospital systems in which we were a subcontractor. They received the grant from a foundation, and then we subcontracted with them, or we were a subawardee for part of that grant for specific activities for which we were responsible. So we weren't the lead for that grant, but those funds were really important, and the mission or the goal of that subcontract aligned perfectly with our mission. So it was a really good mix. Brenda, would you like to talk further about contracts?
Yes. In Kansas, we found that while we started with grants in our early years, we also started transitioning to having contracts specifically with our state health department. And that's probably one of the most frequent questions that I get is how do you go about getting a contract with your state health department? So this isn't a grant. And I can tell you that in Kansas, ours has been specifically with Title V, the block grant, because they have selected the National Performance Measure number 4 around breastfeeding. So they're looking for assistance with the breastfeeding that they already have in their block grant deliverables. And so it's a very good fit for a state coalition to say to the Title V director, for example, we can help you with that. And that's exactly what we've been doing. And then we have the deliverables of what are we going to work on this year? What would you like to work on? And how can our state coalition help with that? It is also expanded to include WIC. While WIC does a lot of work on their own around breastfeeding, it makes a lot of sense to partner with the State Breastfeeding Coalition to leverage that work and to really weave it together with other state projects like Title V. It's also expanded in Kansas to include NICV, which is a federally funded home visiting program. And if you're not familiar with PAT, that stands for Parents as Teachers. So these are all entities that may be working on breastfeeding as a small part or a large part of their work, where a state coalition can come in and say, hey, for a contract, we can help you with your work. We have expertise in that area so that it's a really good fit. And I listed a couple of other examples. Some states, there are 16 states that have SPAN grants. Every state has, and this is a funding source I didn't list, a preventative health and health services grant from the CDC. And they often task or have as a deliverable breastfeeding. So think about who in your state is already required to work on breastfeeding, and then you can put your state coalition forward as a potential contractor to help them with that work. And we have found in Kansas that it's been a combination of grants and contracts that have really been sustainable for us. Grants kind of come and go depending on funders' interests, but the contracts have actually been kind of our bread and butter because these entities are always interested in supporting breastfeeding. Sorry, I'm having a hard time advancing the slides. Here we go. So then we're going to talk about funding. I think that's back to you, Jennifer.
Indeed. So you receive funds, and then what? The really important thing about budgeting is that it doesn't need to be complicated. So probably most or all or many of you have a home budget. It's not that much different. You really want to know, where are your funds coming from and where are they going? I would encourage you to find a simple template. It might be as simple as, we have one grant and we have some memberships and we have 3 contractors and we have some printing expenses and maybe computer expenses. Or it might be multiple sources of funding, and some of those grants have to be used for very specific tasks. And so you have to make sure that you're not spending more than you're allotted for that specific task. Regardless, a fairly simple template will allow you to do that. And you just need to monitor it regularly. It's really easy, no matter if you are paying contractors monthly, as the New Mexico Breastfeeding Task Force does, or if you're paying them in a lump sum, as Kansas does. Either way, you really want to be clear on where those dollars are going and what grants or other funding sources they relate to. But again, it doesn't need to be complicated. And like the grant writing support that I mentioned, I would also encourage you, if you have not done so, to take budgeting courses. And that's actually true if you have a board as well. They need to be able to understand budgets too. The other thing that we wanted to be sure to mention was what Brenda calls indirects and what I call administrative costs. When you receive a grant or any other funding, it doesn't get administered and reported on by magic. It's you. It's the person that is managing the grant, the person that wrote the grant, the person that's going to sign the contracts and manage the contractors, that needs to be part of the budget. You see my little diagram there. This is not the New Mexico Breastfeeding Task Force expenses, by the way. It's just a sample. But you see that I have noted in that expenses chart, 15% admin and fundraising. That's actually pretty low for a nonprofit organization. But whatever it is, it's not wrong to have that in there. In fact, it would be silly not to have it in there. Again, it doesn't happen by magic. You have to submit a report for grants. You have to sign the contracts. You have to manage the contractors. You have to seek partnerships. That's all really hard work that you all are doing, and that should be part of your budget and part of what you are asking for funding support for. We also wanted to mention the beauty of Excel spreadsheets. So if you've never played with an Excel spreadsheet, I would definitely encourage you to do so, because a simple budget template can just be on Excel and you don't need expensive software. Brenda, would you like to talk further about the indirect calculation?
Yes, because this was a part of my learning curve. Early on, when a funder asked us to calculate a budget, and this was one of the first grants that we received, they said, and you can allow up to 10% for indirects. So I calculated backwards. I was like, oh, this is going to be, say, a $90,000 grant. Like, that's the total amount we wanted. So $9,000 would be our 10% indirects. And actually, that's the wrong way to do it. It's the other way around, where I should have listed all of our direct expenses. That's the budget part Jennifer was talking about. And then the 10% is calculated from that. So, for example, I would have had to have had $90,000 worth of expenses, then $9,000 of indirects, which means that my request would be then for $99,000. So I just point that out because I had to learn that. And actually, it was the funder who corrected me. And I thought, wow, I could share that with somebody. So maybe you don't have to do the same thing. But how you calculate it, and always pay attention to the rules in the grant. They will say what the upper limit is, that 10% or 15% or 8%. But always make sure that you're using that. Like Jennifer said, if they allow for it, you should be taking that. And you don't have to detail out how it's being used. It's just what they consider those administrative costs. So make sure you know how to calculate it, and make sure that you're taking advantage of the full amount that a contractor or a grantor allows. And then I do want to touch on the last two things about professional invoices. Now, with grants, usually the grantors will give you payments on a scheduled basis. You have to submit anything. Oh, are you still there?
Yes.
Nope. Oh, okay. Sorry, I had a beep in my phone. So you don't have to submit invoices usually for grants, but for contracts you do. They'll say in order to get paid by this contract, you have to submit either it's called an affidavit of expenses or an invoice on a regular basis. And you have to support that invoice with receipts, or if you're paying independent contractors, copies of those contracts so they know how those expenses are actually being used. And they're usually done in retrospect. In other words, you're going to submit an invoice, say, for the last quarter worth of expenses. Sometimes a funder will recognize you may not have money to do an entire quarter's worth of expenses on your own, and they may give you an advance on some of that payment. But make sure that your invoices are professional, that they have your logo, for example, on them, that they have a formal layout to them, and that it's really clear for the contractor to see the total amount of the award minus what this invoice is and the remaining balance on that contract. And then lastly, I know that Jennifer mentioned Excel spreadsheets. The technical software just needs to evolve as your needs evolve for reports. When we first started, we had the Excel spreadsheet, and it worked beautifully when we had one contract or one grant, and then that entire spreadsheet was the report to the funder. But as we got more and more grants, we needed multiple reports specific to that funder or contractor. Then we evolved to we're using QuickBooks, but you could research what all the different platforms are out there to meet your needs for reports. But just recognizing that that may need to evolve as your needs to generate reports for funders evolves. Okay, and I think with that we can move to the next slide, and that's Monica is going to talk to us about partners.
As Jennifer mentioned, we need to take the blinders off, and I want to talk a little bit about that, about thinking outside of the lactation box and what that means. Usually whenever we're looking for partners or grants or anything like that, we're looking for the keywords that would that we usually use, breastfeeding being or lactation being one of them, parents, pregnant women, children, babies. Those are the common words that we use in our everyday language, and therefore we think about only looking for partners or seeking grants that have those words in them. But consider other parts or other partners that impact or work with pregnant families, breastfeeding families that may not have lactation in the word itself. One of the examples is for New Mexico Breastfeeding Task Force, as Jen mentioned, we are working in creating and supporting lactation counselors throughout the state. So one of the grants we're looking for is an economic development grant that has that, if you think about it, can support the lactation work as a private practice, but normally you wouldn't think that it fits with lactation. Another one that we're working with is our Family Friendly New Mexico organization that awards businesses for family-friendly policies in place. Lactation is one of the many policies that they have that grant a workplace to be family friendly, yet it's a very important one. And so we've partnered with them in that way. It's also important to think about other ones that may work with your organization and that not necessarily fit that the general partners that we usually think about. Brenda mentioned another one, which is home visitors. Their role in the breastfeeding community or with the breastfeeding families is very short-lived, right? However, because they serve pregnant families and they serve families all the way to 3 or 4 years. However, we can play a very important role in supporting them, and sometimes they're not aware of that. So sometimes it takes us to come up to them, build that relationship, and say, hey, can we partner this way? Or this is a place where we can support your work. And Brenda, you want to talk a little bit more?
Yes, I do, specifically about one of the key messages about staying aware of your capacity. And I am speaking from experience with our state coalition that building relationships is critical for taking our coalition to the next level, because relationship building builds trust, it builds credibility, and many of the contracts that we have now were actually the result of maybe like I call them the hallway conversation. There's a meeting or a conference, and I'm speaking with someone out in the hallway about what do they do and what is their work involved, and gee, we could help with that, or breastfeeding is related to that, just like what Monica was talking about. So we start to build a relationship, and they see that they can trust us because we show up at meetings and we are on those conference calls, or we're on the webinars that they're hosting, and that we show up. But there's a price for that, just showing up. As you all know, with coalitions, we're volunteers for the most part, and it's not always possible to keep showing up as volunteers to help someone else with their work. So I mentioned that staying aware of capacity. While in the beginning, it's important to build relationships and to show up on a regular basis to say, you know, we're here. At some point, it makes sense to say, and we can help you with this, and we need to be paid for our time to do that. And I know for me, for the first couple of times, that was very awkward to do because I have such a history of just doing things for free. And sure, we'll do that. And our whole, I think, lactation has been founded on a lot of volunteerism. But at some point, it is okay to say that we can help you with this and our services are valuable. And here's what it would cost for us to help you with that particular deliverable in your work around breastfeeding, or to, you know, whatever it is that you've been working with them on. So stay aware of your volunteer capacity, and it's okay to ask for money. I guess that's the key message I want to get across. Okay, and then I think, Jennifer, you were going to talk with us about some other ways to grow beyond just money.
Correct. So I'm going to lead off of what Brenda just said about capacity, starting to talk about board governance. So when your nonprofit, your coalition gets to the place where you have a full-on board, keep in mind that board engagement, true, real, good board engagement, also takes time. And you have to build that into the capacity that you have to manage all of the things ahead of you: grants, contractors, programs and projects, and board engagement. Board governance is so important, and that transition that you might be considering or might be in the middle of making from a grassroots board where the volunteers are really hands-on with the programs and projects to more of a higher level governance board takes a lot of work. There are a lot of principles and practices and best practices that are really important to move that board to the next level. The focus of a board at that level is just two things: governance or oversight and fundraising. Those are the responsibility of the board. The actual staff engagement, the way the contractors are managed, and the way that the projects and programs are managed are staff-led. And sometimes that fine white line is part of that huge difference from grassroots to a higher level board. That takes time, and you have to really work hard on that. Fortunately, again, USBC has power tools that can help you think about board training. And when we get to the last slide in a minute, we'll talk about other resources as well. Definitely seek support for that. We also wanted to touch on strategic plans and action plans. There's a difference. Lots of boards go through, and lots of organizations go through the process of strategic plan development. I've done a ton of it myself. There's a difference between a 3 to 5 year vision, strategic plan, and the action plan for the following year and what you're actually going to accomplish. The action plan answers who is doing what, when, and why, and measurably, how will we know that it's making a difference? Finally, we wanted to touch on chapters and local coalitions. This also relates to capacity. For us here in New Mexico, we have statewide chapters, or we have chapters statewide, I should say. We would not be the New Mexico Breastfeeding Task Force without those chapters. They are really important to engagement in all of our very rural communities. In addition, we partner with other coalitions like the Zuni Breastfeeding Coalition and the Navajo Nation Breastfeeding Coalition. We think about how we can work together to accomplish our mutual goals. Brenda, I think you wanted to take the next bit and talk about your local coalitions.
Yes, we also have local coalitions. We just call them differently than chapters. And this is something that we've intentionally grown and fostered the support and the growth of local coalitions across our state. And over the years, as those number of coalitions have grown and as they have matured, our relationship with them has also matured and grown as well. In the beginning, when a coalition is just forming, the Kansas Breastfeeding Coalition provides meeting facilitation, for example, agenda templates, mission and vision writing assistance, that kind of thing. But as they grow and start to do their own projects and work on issues locally or within the communities that they've identified, we really take more of a supportive role. What do you need? And we see our job as getting the local coalitions the resources that they need to be successful. And they operate very autonomously from us. So I just wanted to mention that that's how it's structured in our state. Okay, and with that, I think we're going to wrap up. We just have two more slides here that are a list of the resources that we think might be helpful to you. So if you do download the PDF of the slides, these links are live, and you can go to some of these three specifically we think would be really instrumental in taking your coalition to that next level. Specifically, the first one, talking about charity, as I mentioned, that at some point you do need to ask for funding, and that's really hits the nail on the head with that. And then also, I did a presentation, the diverse funding, talking about all the diverse funding sources. So if you really want to know more about what we were talking about earlier with contracts, there's a more detailed webinar there, as well as the racial equity webinar series, which helps us to really think thoughtfully about working in solidarity with groups who are already working on this for their communities. And then most states have a center for nonprofit, whether it's called, in Kansas, we have the Kansas Chamber of Nonprofit Services. But if you just Google for your state and put in nonprofit assistance, you'll see centers or chambers come up. And I have learned a lot from our state coalition. They put together what they call an ED survival series. And I've learned from executive directors of larger organizations how to move even to the next level for our coalition outside of lactation, for example. So we do encourage you to reach out to the nonprofit resources in your state and also within the USBC, because you don't have to go this alone. And in that, I will take us to our contact information, because you don't have to go it alone. We are available to help. So our email addresses are shown here. And I know I can't speak for Jennifer and Monica, but I am available by email if you need templates or examples of how something might be written for that invoice or the independent contractor agreement. I am happy to share with you what we have developed and what we're using, because we stand on the shoulders of others. So we're happy to help pay that forward.
Brenda, this is Jennifer. I just want to add that the New Mexico Center for Nonprofit Excellence, which you can visit centerfornonprofitexcellence.org, has a downloadable guide called the Principles and Practices Guide that takes you through everything a nonprofit organization would need from kind of soup to nuts. And it is, you can get actual physical copies or you can download the information. And it's valuable no matter where your organization is located. So that is available nationwide.
Great. Good to know. So I'm looking at our time and I see we have 15 minutes left for discussion. And this is hopefully going to be an extension of the email discussion on the USBC Coalition's discussion list. What is it that coalitions would like to know? What is it your coalition is struggling with? I know that we have a couple of others that we've asked to be on today's call. We have Shannon McKinney-Schubert from the Michigan Breastfeeding Task Force, and Network. And we also have Linda Kopecki with the Minnesota Breastfeeding Coalition, formerly with Colorado. So we have others on the call that can chime in as well to give you the full spectrum of answers.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, ladies, for such a wonderful presentation. We do have lots of questions that have come in. I want to sort of pick up where we left off, talking about partnerships and partnering with local chapters and local coalitions. This question comes from Patricia, who asks, how did you get local chapters to be interested in actually becoming and forming a chapter? Did they start as part of local health departments or WIC? And Tina also asked, in conjunction with this, how do you encourage local areas to develop coalitions, local coalitions?
I would ask Monica if she could speak to this, because she's done so much great work with our local chapters.
Thank you, Jen. So one of the things that you want to do if you're looking to encourage or create chapters within your different communities is look for those partners, right? Build those partnerships and relationships that Brenda was talking about. So it is going to other organizations' meetings and look into your WIC office, your health offices. Look into some of the meetings that happen regarding like health council meetings are a great place to find partners and stakeholders that may be interested in forming the chapter. And looking for your advocates, those people that are already involved with your statewide organization. There's a lot of the times that they're just looking for ways to partner and do work within their own communities. So you end up being that person that connects them to build a chapter. One of the things that Jen and I have worked really and extensive on is standardizing our documentation for our chapters to help as the people move from one part of their life into another, from one role to another. Then a lot of the times we had chapters that were very active for a while, and then the person moved or went to a different job or just had other priorities, and they couldn't be part of the chapter anymore, and the chapters fizzled out. So in order to help those chapters stay, we've built a transition plan. We build standard templates, as Brenda mentioned. We build collaborative meetings where all the chapters come together just to share ideas. And those have been ways that even community members that are interested in forming a chapter or being part of the chapter, but they're a little bit apprehensive as far as how much work it's going to take or what the commitment is, they're invited to join us during those calls so they can see what other communities are doing and they can ask questions. And then most of the time, they do end up forming a chapter within their community.
Mm-hmm. And Monica, this is Brenda. I would just like to extend what you said about making it easy for them. I think that's the role of our state coalition in Kansas, is that we make it easy for local groups to form. And we joke that wherever 3 or more people gather in the name of breastfeeding, that is a coalition. So it's really a low bar, but we know that if those 3 people are the key 3 people, that a lot of things can get done, especially in small rural areas. So we don't make it intimidating. There isn't a formal definition of a coalition. We just want to see a group that's meeting on a regular basis. So we make it easy. And we also give them, like Monica, you described, tools. And so we have an agenda. We have even a startup meeting facilitation. Like if there's an interest in your community, we will come out and help facilitate that first meeting to see if there's interest in a coalition. And then once they're formed, we have ongoing supports. We have every other month conference calls for our local coalitions to call in, kind of like this, to troubleshoot and to support each other and to say, this is what my local coalition is struggling with. So once they gather, support them and make it as easy as possible.
Wonderful. Thank you, ladies. Do either of these of your coalitions provide financial support to your local chapters or local coalitions? Is that something that you all have thought about?
Mm-hmm. In Kansas, we just recently, the last 3 years, have provided mini grants to local coalitions. There's an application process, and then we give small, like under $1,000 mini grants. I know Nebraska has done a similar thing. We modeled our program after theirs. So only recently, and that is only for a handful of the coalitions that are selected because we don't have the funding to support. We have 33 coalitions. So we only about anywhere from 5 to 9 in any one year get a mini grant.
Similar to Kansas, New Mexico Breastfeeding Task Force does the same. The projects, the chapters together come at the beginning of the year and identify similar projects that they want to work together on. And this helps them feel unified across the state because we are very rural. And so the chapters identify those specific projects that they want to work on together, all in their own communities, and we provide funding for that. In addition, we provide small World Breastfeeding Week stipends that some of the really, really small chapters, they just focus on that World Breastfeeding Week event. And so we provide a little bit of a stipend for that. And then we support some of our more active and quote unquote sturdy chapters. We support them by seeking additional funding that they can do within their own community. Some of the foundations are regional specific, or they provide very small grants for specific things. And we provide that support to the chapter so that they can be able to seek those grants in order to foster the work that they're doing in their own community.
Mm-hmm. And I'm wondering if Shannon McKinney-Schubert with the Michigan Breastfeeding Network is on the call. I know that they have done some very intentional work with the local community level organizations in supporting their work with breastfeeding. Shannon, are you available and able to chime in on what you've done in Michigan? No, maybe not. Sorry.
Miriam, I just wanted to check. Miriam, is Shannon on the call? Were you able to locate her?
Yeah, so she's definitely on the call. I think too many people are unmuted. So
okay, I think I've located her. So
thank you.
Shannon, your mic is unmuted. So if you wanted to chime in. Go ahead.
All right, yes, I'm back on. Thank you so much. Yeah, this is Shannon McKinney-Schubert with the Michigan Breastfeeding Network. And I missed the last 5 seconds, Brenda, of what you were sharing. So it's just a question about our local engagement. Is that right?
Yes, and the question to the larger group, from the larger group, was about the financial relationship. And I thought you have a really unique view of how you support your local groups financially.
Yeah, okay, absolutely. So everything I'm about to say, you can also find on mibreastfeeding.org, and then click on coalitions. So all of this information is publicly available, and if you want to use it for yourselves, please feel free to. But one of the things so we're really diving into this question right now in the Michigan Breastfeeding Network about what does it mean to be a local coalition and how do we effectively support local work. And one of the things that we're finding is that it's really important for the local group to really well define why they exist. Like, what's their why? What are they trying to do? And how are they contributing? And so Monica was sharing about coming together annually and deciding what they're going to tackle together. And I really want to cheerlead that. I think that's a really important thing for each group, is to determine what are they doing in that space. And so what that helps with, I think that's good structurally, just organizationally. We're finding that the coalitions that become sturdy and have a lot of longevity, their why is really well articulated, and they've all come together around that. It also helps us at the Michigan Breastfeeding Network to be able to support. And so we work on the statewide and local partnerships, and really trust the local groups to name what they need and what's happening in their communities. We say for our definition of a coalition, 3 things: that they need to work on systemic change, that they need to reflect and represent the community that they serve. That's really huge. And I'm so sorry, I'm forgetting the third thing. Anyways, so that's in our blueprint that's listed on the website. But anyways, if they reflect and represent the community that they serve, and they're working on systems change, it's really pretty straightforward for them to come to us and just say, like, we want to do, this thing, whatever, like we're working with child cares, or we're working on normalization, or we're working, workplace, whatever. They just come and say, like, these are the things that they need. And then we work together with them and other funders around the state to meet their work plan and their budget, really trusting that they know what's needed in their community and support them to do it. So
thank you, Shannon. I think that's a great example, and I love your definition, and I love your blueprint for coalition. So if people want to know more, the Michigan Breastfeeding Network is a great resource. Thank you.
And this is Linda Kopecki, and I can also chime in on supporting our local coalitions. I've worked both with the Colorado Breastfeeding Coalition for about 5 years, and I recently relocated to Minnesota and now the interim ED here. And in both places, we provide seed money, and we call them seed money, not necessarily grants, and they're requests, not applications. And it's up to 11 or 12 local coalitions can receive seed money, and it's between $500 and $2,000 each. And it really is because those local coalitions know their community best. They know their resources, they know their communication styles, they know the needs, they know the priorities best. And also, we firmly believe that when you can start with a little bit of money and you can get something going, it can position you for larger pots of money, for local grants, maybe applying to your local community foundation or your local Rotary for bigger grants or bigger projects. But sometimes you need a little bit of money to get started, because we know that traditionally funding goes, and especially in breastfeeding, funding typically goes to those organizations that have a track record, that have grant writers, that have a history, that have the education, or they're positioned well, and not necessarily to those startup organizations or those smaller coalitions. So trying to jumpstart some activity locally is what we do through our seed money projects.
Great. Thanks, Linda. Great examples. Miriam or Danae, I don't know if we have time for one or two more questions.
We are actually at time for questions, but I would actually love to invite our presenters to respond to those questions on our coalition listserv if possible. I would love to send those over to you. Would any of you be available to respond to that?
Well, I guess it depends on the number. We'll divide and conquer. How about that?
That sounds great. We have a lot of... Oh, awesome. Wonderful. We have a lot of wonderful, wonderful questions that we do not want to leave unanswered. So we will continue the conversation offline later today. Be on the lookout, either today or tomorrow. We want to give them some time to be able to look at the questions and provide responses to those questions. Again, if you haven't joined the Coalition's Learning Connection, please be sure to do so that you don't miss out on the conversation. All right, we're going to actually jump into a few USBC updates that we wanted to give you all. So I'm just going to go ahead and take the controls and share my screen so you all can see those updates. And I'm also going to turn it over to Cheryl Lebenovich.
Thank you so much, Danae. This is Cheryl Lebenovich. I serve as Senior Workplace Program Manager and Policy Analyst here at USBC, and we just have 3 quick updates. First, the USBC has mobilized the creation of a COVID-19 infant and young child feeding constellation. So the constellation will serve as a bidirectional learning forum and centralized advocacy hub for the first food field, working through an equity lens to support and coordinate the response to the challenges posed by COVID-19 across the United States. This constellation is comprised of USBC member organizations, and the primary poll contacts for each of the USBC member organizations have received an invitation with information on how to join. So if you're part of a USBC member organization and you think that your organization would be interested in participating, make sure that you check in with your team to make sure that your organization has signed up. And if you don't have this communication, just make sure you reach out to us at USBC so we can get you plugged in. The Carolina Global Breastfeeding Institute and the USBC are going to serve as co-stewards of this constellation, and they've recruited an advisory council of seasoned emergency response organizations and public health entities to really support the constellation moving forward. Everything with all the things that USBC does, all the resources developed by the constellation will be free and accessible to the public. So make sure you stay tuned. Next slide, please, Danae. In a similar vein, we're all watching really significant shifts in the infant feeding landscape. So one of the things that USBC has also done is inviting healthcare providers and pregnant and breastfeeding families and all public health stakeholders to share their insights on how the pandemic is impacting breastfeeding families with our new story collector tool. Through this and other means, USBC is really trying to create a public record. What's the lived experiences of families and providers during this time so that we're really capturing and directing our efforts appropriately. Please visit this link, share your insights, and be sure to share this action opportunity as widely as you can. The more stories we get, the more informed we'll be in our responses. Next slide, please. And finally, the 2020 to 2025 edition of the Dietary Guidelines for Americans will include, for the very first time, nutrition recommendations for infants, toddlers, and pregnant and lactating parents. The Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee has an active public comment opportunity to get input as they develop these guidelines. And USBC has launched an online action tool that includes template comments so that you can respond to this public comment opportunity with just a few clicks, and you can make your edits to the template, to strengthen them and really bring your own insights. But the deadline to submit public comments is June 1st. So we urge all of you to go to the link on the screen, take action, and encourage your network to do the same. That's it from me. Thank you so much.
Wonderful. Thank you, Cheryl. Well, that brings us to the end of today's session. We are a little bit over time, so thank you for hanging with us. Thank you once again to Brenda, Jennifer, and Monica. And thanks to all of you for the vital roles you're playing in improving maternal, infant, and child health throughout the country. We hope that this session provided some ideas on how to take your coalition to the next level, and will also spur ideas for collaborative action. Please complete the webinar evaluation and let us know how we're doing. Your suggestions are valued, and they also help us design future sessions that are most relevant to you. You also receive a certificate of attendance when you complete that evaluation. So again, thank you for tuning in. Please take care, stay safe, and we look forward to having you all for our next webinar. Thank you.